You're watching the History Fella channel. In this video we're looking at the Battle of Front Royal. The Battle of Front Royal, also known as Guard Hill or Cedarville, was fought on May the 23rd, 1862, during the American Civil War as part of Jackson's Valley Campaign. Confederate forces, commanded by Major General Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson, were trying to keep Union forces engaged in the Shenandoah Valley to prevent them from joining the Peninsula Campaign. After defeating Major General John C. Fremont's force in the Battle of McDowell, Jackson turned against the forces of Major General Nathaniel Banks. Banks had most of his force at Strasburg, Virginia, with smaller detachments at Winchester and Front Royal. Jackson attacked the position at Front Royal on May the 23rd, surprising the Union defenders, who were led by Colonel John Reese Kenly. Kenly's men made a stand on Richardson's Hill and used artillery fire to hold off the Confederates. Before their line of escape over the South Fork and North Fork of the Shenandoah Valley were threatened, the Union troops then withdrew across both forks to Guard Hill, where they made a stand until Confederate troops were able to get across the North Fork. Kenly made one last stand at Cedarville, but an attack by 250 Confederate cavalrymen shattered the Union position. Many of the Union soldiers were captured, but Banks was able to withdraw his main force to Winchester. 2 days later, Jackson then drove Banks out of Winchester and won 2 further victories in June. Jackson's campaign in the Shenandoah Valley had tied down 60,000 Union troops from joining the Peninsula Campaign, and his men were able to join Robert E. Lee's Confederate force in time for the 7 days' battles. In March 1862, during the American Civil War, Union forces, led by the Major General George B. McClellan, began the Peninsula Campaign on the Virginia Peninsula. To the west, in the Shenandoah Valley, Union Major General Nathaniel Banks pushed the Confederate troops of Major General Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson to the south. Jackson had orders to try to distract Union troops in the valley so that they would not be available for McClellan. By March the 21st, Union High Command decided that much of Banks's force was not necessary for the security of the Shenandoah Valley, and much of it was sent to Washington, D.C., leaving only about 9,000 of Banks's 35,000 men left in the valley. On March the 23rd, Jackson attacked the Union forces in the valley in the First Battle of Kernstown. The Confederate attack was repulsed, but it was still considered concerning enough to return the rest of Banks's command to the valley and to hold another corps at Manassas, Virginia, depriving McClellan's campaign of about 60,000 men. After Kernstown, Jackson withdrew south in the valley, where he joined forces with Major General Richard Ewell. Leaving Ewell and his men to face Banks, Jackson took his troops southwest towards McDowell, Virginia. In early May, to confront Union force commanded by Major General John C. Fremont, part of Fremont's command, led by Brigadier General Robert H. Milroy, attacked Jackson's men on May the 8th in the Battle of McDowell. The Confederates were victorious, and Fremont withdrew his force. Jackson then moved his men back north to face Banks. By then, part of Banks's force had again been transferred out of the valley, and on May the 12th, the division of Brigadier General James Shields was ordered east. Banks then withdrew his remaining force to Strasburg. Meanwhile, Ewell had received an order on May the 17th, dated May the 13th, from General Joseph E. Johnston, to take his force from the valley to support Johnston's army against McClellan. Jackson sent a message to Johnston that same day, requesting that Ewell be allowed to remain with his command so that a blow could be struck against Banks. And on May the 18th, Jackson and Ewell decided that Ewell should remain under Jackson's authority until a reply from Johnston was received. As it took several days for communications to travel between Jackson and Johnston, Jackson did not receive a reply on May the 20th. Then another set of orders for Ewell were to move east were received. Jackson then contacted General Robert E. Lee, an advisor to Confederate President Jefferson Davis, requesting the continued use of Ewell's men. But another message from Johnston arrived later that day, giving Jackson discretionary use of Ewell's command. Between Jackson and Ewell's forces, the Confederates nominally had 17,000 men, although historian Gary Easelbarger estimates that due to desertion and straggling, the true number of the effective group was closer to 12,000 or 14,000. The Confederates resumed moving north to strike Banks. The Union forces at Strasburg had built fortifications facing south, but Jackson decided to move to the east and destroy the Union outpost at Front Royal. By taking Front Royal, Jackson could sever Banks's communications to the east and then get into the rear of Strasburg position, either capturing it or forcing it into its abandonment. The Confederates began their march on May the 21st, crossing Manhattan Mountain and then entering the Page Valley to approach Front Royal. At the time of the Confederate approach, Banks had around 6,500 men in Strasburg, about 1,000 in Front Royal and 1,000 in Winchester. Jackson did not know the exact Union strength, but was aware that the force at Front Royal was weaker than that at Strasburg. Front Royal and Strasburg were separated by about 12 miles. On the more direct railroad route, although longer paths existed on roads. Jackson prepared his attack on the morning of May the 23rd. Colonel Turner Ashby's cavalry was sent between Front Royal and Strasburg to cut telegraph lines and the railroad to prevent Union forces from moving between the two towns. Unaware that he greatly outnumbered the Union force in Front Royal, Jackson decided against attacking from the direct route, the Luray Road. Instead, Ewell's men were to take Goonie Manor Road in a flanking attack. The Stonewall Brigade and some artillery were to remain at Ashby's Chapel, which was 4.5 miles from Front Royal. Any Union forces withdrawing from Front Royal would have to cross both the South Fork and the North Fork of the Shenandoah River. Easelbarger suggests that the decision to concentrate on a single road would also prevent Union escapes or escapees from Front Royal from providing Banks with an accurate estimate of the size of Jackson's command. The Confederates learned from captured pickets that the Union force in Front Royal was the 1st Maryland Infantry Regiment, so Jackson ordered the Confederate 1st Maryland Infantry Regiment to the front of the Confederate column. The Confederate Maryland Regiment had recently had an incident with mutiny, but Colonel Bradley T. Johnson made a patriotic speech that energized the unit. At about 2 p.m. the Confederate attack began, with the Marylanders in front and Major Robert Wheat's notoriously unruly battalion of Louisiana Tigers behind, with the rest of the Brigadier General Richard Taylor's Louisiana Brigade in reserve. The Maryland Regiment and Wheat's men totaled about 450 men. Bell Boyd rode from the town to give Jackson information about the Union force. Although historian James I. Robertson Jr. notes that Boyd's significance at Front Royal had also been greatly exaggerated, and historian Peter Cousins states that Boyd told Jackson little or nothing about the Yankee force that he did not already know. The Union troops were caught by surprise. Unaware that the Confederates had infantry in the area, Banks had not stationed any cavalry at Front Royal, and the lack of cavalry in the morning prevented Union forces from learning the Confederate advance earlier. The Confederate attack quickly drove the Union forces from Front Royal and their camp, and the Union commander, Colonel John Reese Kenly, withdrew what remained of his force into Richardson's Hill, a height between Front Royal and the South Fork, and deployed 2 10-pounder Parrott rifles. Some of Kenly's men were captured within the town, and the Union supply train was captured as well. Not much organized resistance was met within the town. One Confederate soldier referred to the town stage of the battle as more like a police riot than a fight between soldiers. In front of the new Union position was an open meadow, which would have to be crossed to a frontally attack of Kenly's position. Kenly had about 700 infantrymen remaining in line at this point. The 2 Parrott guns fired effectively on the Confederates. Excuse me. With the 2 Union cannon battering his lines, Jackson had his chief of artillery, Colonel Stapleton Crutchfield, bring up artillery to counter the Union fire. But the 1st battery was armed only with guns of too short of range to reach the Union position. Crutchfield was eventually able to locate 3 cannons with long enough ranges, and a 15-minute artillery duel followed. Kenly tried to make his line seem stronger than it actually was. A small detachment of the 29th Pennsylvania guarded the area between the 2 forks of the river, and 100 men from 2 companies of the 5th New York Cavalry, which Banks had sent from Strasburg that morning, despite being unaware of the battle. These arrived and sortied against the skirmishers of the Confederate 1st Maryland. Meanwhile, Johnson's Marylanders attacked from the center. The 6th Louisiana Infantry attacked the Union left, and more of Taylor's men fought with the Union right. Some of the Confederate cavalry to the west, and the 2nd Virginia Cavalry and the 6th Virginia Cavalry under Colonel Thomas Flournoy also raced for the bridge over the North Fork, as Confederate control of that bridge cut off the last Union line of retreat. These cavalrymen had cut railroad and telegraph lines earlier in the day before heading for the fighting at Front Royal. The arrival of Flournoy's cavalry convinced Kenly to withdraw around 4:30. The Union troops withdrew across the bridges over the South Fork and the North Fork and lit the bridges on fire and burned some of their supplies to prevent them from falling into Confederate hands. The Confederates were able to put out the fires on the South Fork Bridge, and Jackson sent aides to bring up the artillery, and Stonewall Brigade left at Asbury's Chapel. While the commander of Stonewall's brigade, Brigadier General Charles Sidney Winder, had put his men and the artillery in march behind the rest of the Confederate troops, they were still too far to the rear to be available for the fighting at Front Royal. Kenly reformed his command on Guard Hill, across the North Fork, while many of the Confederates became disorganized and plundered the abandoned Union camp. With the addition of about 100 men from the detachment of the 29th Pennsylvania, Kenly defended Guard Hill with about 800 men. News did not reach Banks of the fighting at the Front Royal until about 5:45, when a single messenger reached his headquarters. At around 6 o'clock, a few of Flournoy's men were able to cross at a ford, and part of the 8th Louisiana Infantry were able to swim across. They were able to douse the fire on the North Fork Bridge. While a portion of the bridge collapsed, enough of the span remained that men could cross single file. With the guard held position untenable with Confederates across the river, Kenly withdrew his men to the hamlet of Cedarville, Virginia. Jackson ordered Flournoy to push 250 cavalrymen across the charred bridge and pursue the Union troops. Jackson himself followed behind Flournoy's men, making a stand around 1.5 miles north of Cedarville. Kenly deployed his artillery and ordered the New York cavalrymen to charge. Instead of the cavalry's commander lost his nerve and ordered his men to flee the field. The remaining Union troops formed a line at Fairview, the house of local man Thomas McKay. Flournoy's men charged the position twice. Undeterred by a volley from the Union troops that cut apart Company B of the 6th Virginia, the Union line broke into confusion in the melee. Kenly suffered multiple wounds during the melee and was captured as part of the Union troops. While Jackson had fought at Front Royal, Ashby had encountered Union troops during his mission. At about 2 p.m. his men attacked Buckton Station on the Manassas Gap Railroad. The position was defended by elements of the 3rd Wisconsin Infantry and the 27th Indiana Infantry, a force of about 150 men. An attack made by 300 Confederates was repulsed with the loss of 2 promising officers, and a second charge fared little better. Withdrawing down to the railroad, Ashby had the railroad line and the telegraph wires cut, accomplishing this purpose of isolating Front Royal from Banks. Cousins describes the needless fighting at Buckton Station as a waste of lives. Cousins places Jackson's losses, excluding Ashby's action, at 36 men killed and wounded, while stating that Kenly's force suffered 773 casualties, of which 691 were as prisoners. Robertson estimates the Union prisoners at 700 and places Jackson's losses at less than 100. The National Park Service gives Union losses at about 904 and Confederate losses at 56. Historian Robert G. Tanner says the Union lost about 900 men and the Confederates a little over 100. Easelbarger estimates Union losses at about 900. The Confederates also captured both Parrott rifles, a number of wagons, and about $300,000 worth of supplies. Ashby's expedition netted the capture of 2 locomotives. A Union soldier, William Taylor, was awarded the Medal of Honor in 1897 for his actions in the bridge burning at Front Royal and in the latter Battle of Weldon Railroad. To prevent being cut off from Winchester, Banks responded to the fall of Front Royal by rapidly withdrawing from Strasburg. Jackson attacked part of the withdrawing force at Middletown the next day and then defeated Banks in the First Battle of Winchester on May the 25th. After defeating Banks at Winchester, Jackson advanced his force towards Harper's Ferry. Meanwhile, Fremont and Shields moved their forces towards Strasburg to concentrate against Jackson. Ashby was killed during a skirmish on June the 6th. Ewell was tasked with fighting Fremont and defeated his force at the Battle of Cross Keys on June the 8th. While leaving the field at Cross Keys to rejoin Jackson, Ewell's men burned the bridge to prevent Fremont from joining forces with Shields. On June the 9th, Jackson defeated Shields in the Battle of the Port Republic. With Shields and Fremont withdrawn, Jackson was able to take his force from the Shenandoah Valley and joined Lee's army for the 7 days battles. Jackson's Valley campaign had successfully prevented Union forces from joining McClellan. If you found the information in this video informative or helpful, please feel free to give the video a thumbs up, and I thank you very much for watching and listening to this video. Please feel free to subscribe and join the channel.